The first time I realized something was wrong, nobody else seemed to notice it. Or maybe they noticed and simply shrugged because that's what people do when life gets busy. Looking back now, I sometimes wonder if that little traffic light at the entrance to Brookstone Ridge was quietly testing everyone who drove past it, asking who was willing to pay attention and who was content to assume someone smarter had already done the thinking. It was the first week of April, one of those chilly mornings after an overnight rain when the air smells like wet dirt and fresh-cut grass. I was kneeling beside my mailbox, pulling weeds that somehow came back every single spring, no matter how many times I dug them out, when a dark gray SUV with the Brookstone Ridge Community Association logo rolled toward the intersection across from my property. My place wasn't inside their neighborhood. Never had been. My grandfather bought this little piece of land decades before that subdivision ever existed, back when there were soybean fields, instead of rows of identical houses with matching mailboxes and perfectly trimmed shrubs. The developers built their grand brick entrance right across the road from me, and over the years I'd become an unwilling front-row spectator to everything that happened there. You learn a lot when your front porch faces the only entrance to 600 homes. At first, nothing seemed unusual, until I looked up at the traffic light and realized the rhythm felt off. I couldn't have explained it if someone had asked. It was just one of those strange instincts you get after watching the same thing every day for years. Cars flying down the highway barely slowed before the light turned green again, while vehicles trying to leave the subdivision stacked up farther and farther toward the clubhouse. I remember standing there with muddy gloves in my hands thinking, that's odd. Wasn't that red light usually shorter? Then I laughed at myself because who keeps track of traffic signals? Apparently I did. Over the next couple of days, I kept noticing it without trying. I'd be drinking coffee on my porch, reading the local paper, or walking my old Labrador, Hank, and every single time the pattern looked the same. Highway traffic moved almost without interruption, while families trying to get out of Brookstone Ridge waded through what felt like forever. Soccer moms tapped their steering wheels. Contractors leaned out of pickup windows. Delivery vans missed gaps they normally would have made. It wasn't dramatic, not yet. It was just irritating enough to make people grumble under their breath. A few mornings later, I ran into an older woman named Linda while she was checking her mailbox near the entrance. We chatted off and on for years, even though I didn't live behind those fancy brick walls. She gave me one of those exhausted smiles people wear when they've been dealing with the same problem for too long. "You noticed the traffic?" she asked before I could even say hello. I nodded. Thought maybe I was imagining it. She shook her head. The board sent everyone a notice. They said they adjusted the signal to improve traffic flow. I looked past her toward another line of cars stretching almost halfway around the first curve inside the neighborhood. Improve it for who? I asked. She laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that meant something was funny. It was the kind people use when they're already getting up. That's exactly what my husband said. After she drove away, I stayed outside longer than I meant to. Something kept bothering me. Maybe it was because nothing about that intersection had ever been particularly dangerous before. Sure, it got busy during rush hour, but people managed. Now the delays were becoming impossible to ignore. Every afternoon, engines idled for minutes at a time. Kids on bicycles waited impatiently beside frustrated parents. Horns started replacing friendly waves. The whole mood around the entrance changed, almost like someone had quietly turned the neighborhood's blood pressure up 10 points. Even Hank seemed annoyed by the constant noise. One afternoon, I watched a landscaping crew miss 3 separate chances to pull onto the highway before one of the workers finally muttered something I probably shouldn't repeat and slapped the dashboard hard enough for me to hear it from across the road. That's when I stopped believing it was an innocent adjustment. Somebody had changed something for a reason. I just couldn't figure out whose reason it was. Still, I had no idea that within a matter of days, that tiny decision would stop being an inconvenience and become something none of us would ever forget. If you want to continue with part 2, just type P2. I'd barely finished that thought when the whole thing stopped being about inconvenience and started feeling personal. A Friday afternoon, just before 5, the kind of hour when everyone is racing home. I was in my garage putting away a socket set when I heard sirens cutting through the neighborhood. Not unusual. Ambulances came through from time to time. What was unusual was that the siren never faded. It just kept echoing, rising and falling in the exact same place. I walked down my driveway and could already see flashing red and blue lights bouncing off the wet pavement near the entrance. An ambulance had pulled up to the intersection, but it wasn't moving. It was trapped behind a line of cars waiting at the light while traffic on the highway flowed almost nonstop as if nothing else in the world mattered. Drivers inside Brookstone Ridge leaned on their horns, some waving frantically, others trying to inch into tiny gaps that disappeared before they could move. The paramedic in the passenger seat slapped the dashboard with an open hand before grabbing the radio again. Even from where I stood, I could hear the urgency in his voice. Finally, a county deputy arrived from the opposite direction, jumped out of his cruiser, stepped into traffic with both arms raised, and physically stopped 4 lanes of vehicles so the ambulance could squeeze through. The entire delay couldn't have been more than a minute or two. But when somebody inside that ambulance is fighting for another breath, a minute suddenly feels enormous. That night, I couldn't shake the image. I sat on my porch long after sunset with Hank sleeping beside my chair, replaying everything I'd seen. Maybe the patient survived. Maybe they didn't. I didn't know. But I kept asking myself the same question. Who decides convenience is worth gambling with someone else's emergency? Sleep wasn't happening. So I did what my late father always used to do whenever something didn't add up. I started digging. Dad had spent 30 years working for the county highway department, and one lesson he drilled into me was simple. Every decision leaves paperwork. If you want the truth, follow the paperwork. The next morning, I drove to the county transportation office, expecting little more than a polite brush-off. Instead, a woman behind the records counter smiled when I asked about signal timing modifications. "Public records request?" she asked. "Sure is," I answered. She slid a form across the counter. "Might take a few days." 4 days later, she called. I picked up a thin envelope that looked completely ordinary, but inside it were documents that made my stomach tighten. There it was in black and white. A formal request to modify the signal timing had been submitted by Brookstone Ridge Community Association through a consulting firm representing a commercial development company called Hawthorne Retail Group. The justification sounded harmless enough: improve regional traffic efficiency, reduce congestion on the state highway, increase commercial accessibility. Fancy words, expensive words, the kind that sound responsible until you ask who pays the price. Then it hit me. A few weeks earlier, I'd driven past a brand new shopping center less than a mile down that same highway. The banners were still hanging from the light poles announcing grand openings, new restaurants, premium retail, family entertainment. If traffic on the highway never had to stop, shoppers would reach those stores faster. Meanwhile, everyone trying to leave Brookstone Ridge, including emergency vehicles, simply became collateral damage. I spread the documents across my kitchen table and just stared at them. "No," I muttered to myself. "There's no way that's the whole story." So I started talking to people. Linda invited me over for coffee, and before long her husband, Frank, pulled out a folder thick with printed emails from HOA meetings. Residents had complained for weeks. Some couldn't get to work on time. Parents said they were missing school drop-offs. A delivery driver who lived inside the neighborhood claimed he'd started leaving 20 minutes earlier every morning just to make it through the intersection. Every complaint received the same carefully polished response from the board. "The engineers assure us this adjustment improves overall traffic conditions. Thank you for your patience." Reading those emails, I noticed something interesting. Nobody from the board ever explained how they reached that conclusion. They simply repeated it until people stopped asking. That's when I decided I wasn't interested in arguing with the HOA anymore. I wanted someone outside that neighborhood to ask questions they couldn't ignore. A friend of mine, Mike, worked as a freelance cameraman for a local television station. We'd coached Little League together years before. I called him, expecting he'd tell me the story was too small to matter. Instead, he listened quietly while I explained everything. "You have documents?" he asked. "Copies sitting right in front of me?" There was a pause. Don't email them. I'll come by. The following afternoon, Mike pulled into my driveway carrying nothing but a camera bag and a legal pad. We spread every document across my picnic table while Hank wandered underneath, hoping someone would drop a sandwich. Mike read each page without saying much. Finally, he looked up. If these are legitimate, they are. Then somebody needs to answer for this. 2 days later, a reporter named Rachel showed up with a full news crew. She wasn't flashy. She didn't try to create drama where there wasn't any. She simply asked me to walk her through the timeline exactly as I'd experienced it. So we stood beside my old weathered mailbox, the one that's probably been hit by more baseballs than actual mail trucks, with the neighborhood entrance sitting over my shoulder. "Why did you get involved if you don't even live inside Brookstone Ridge?" she asked. I looked across the street where another line of cars had already begun forming. "Because traffic lights don't care whose HOA dues you pay," I answered. "If something's dangerous, it's dangerous for everybody." She smiled just a little. "That's a pretty good answer." The story aired that evening. By breakfast the next morning, my phone wouldn't stop buzzing. People I'd never met were calling, emailing, leaving messages. Some thanked me. Others shared nearly identical stories from neighborhoods across the state where convenience had somehow become more important than common sense. Then came the call nobody on the HOA board expected. The county announced it was opening an immediate review of the signal modification and requested every communication between the association, the consulting firm, and Hawthorne Retail Group. Suddenly, the people who had spent weeks telling residents everything was under control were no longer speaking with the same confidence. Board members stopped making eye contact during community meetings. Rumors spread faster than facts. Some residents blamed the developer. Others blamed the HOA president. A few insisted the whole thing had been misunderstood from the beginning. Standing on my porch that evening, watching television vans replace impatient commuters at the entrance, I realized the traffic light had become something much bigger than an intersection. It had become a mirror, reflecting exactly what happens when ordinary people stop asking simple questions, and what can happen when even one person decides not to look away. I'd love to tell you everything changed overnight, that the HOA held a press conference, admitted they were wrong, apologized to every resident, and promised to never put convenience ahead of safety again. But life doesn't usually work like that. Real accountability rarely arrives with dramatic speeches. Most of the time, it shows up quietly, hidden inside paperwork, policy changes, and uncomfortable silence. That's exactly what happened here. The week after the television report aired, the Brookstone Ridge board went strangely quiet. Their social media pages stopped posting updates. The notice about the Traffic Flow Improvement Initiative quietly disappeared from the community website without a word. The monthly board meeting was postponed because of what they called scheduling conflicts, although everyone knew exactly why. Residents who had been ignored for weeks suddenly started receiving polite emails thanking them for their patience, while the association cooperated with the county's review. Funny how quickly people's tone changes when someone else starts asking the questions. Then the county engineers released their findings. They didn't accuse anyone of intentionally putting lives at risk, but they didn't sugarcoat the consequences either. Their report explained that their revised signal timing heavily favored traffic traveling toward the new retail development, while significantly increasing delays for vehicles leaving the subdivision. More importantly, the review concluded that emergency access had never been properly evaluated before the timing changes were approved. Reading that sentence hit me harder than I expected. Nobody had set out hoping an ambulance would get stuck, but somewhere along the line, somebody had decided that improving shopping traffic was worth more discussion than protecting emergency response times. That realization bothered me more than anything else. The original timing was restored within 48 hours. I remember standing on my porch that first morning with a mug of coffee warming my hands, while the intersection settled back into the rhythm I'd watched for years. Cars from the highway paused. Families leaving the neighborhood made their turns without panic. School buses weren't trapped behind endless lines of brake lights anymore. Even the air seemed quieter without the constant symphony of frustrated horns echoing through the neighborhood. Hank lay beside my chair, completely unimpressed by any of it. More interested in watching squirrels than celebrating restored traffic patterns. I scratched behind his ears and laughed to myself. Guess we finally got our old intersection back. Buddy, he wagged his tail like he'd known all along things would work out eventually. A little while later, Linda pulled over at the end of my driveway. She stepped out, holding 2 paper cups from the little coffee shop down the road, and handed one to me without saying a word. We leaned against the fence, watching traffic move normally for several minutes before she finally smiled. "You know," she said, "my husband got to work 10 minutes early today for the first time in over a month." I laughed. "That's probably the cheapest victory anybody's ever celebrated." She shook her head. "It isn't about getting to work early." She looked toward the intersection before continuing. "It's knowing someone finally listened." That stayed with me. Not because it sounded profound, but because it was true. Most people don't expect perfection from the people running their communities. They just want to believe somebody is actually listening when they speak. A few days later, I found an envelope tucked inside my mailbox without a return address. Inside was a handwritten card from the family of the man who had suffered the medical emergency that Friday afternoon. They never mentioned whether the delay had changed the outcome. Maybe they didn't want to. Maybe it didn't. The note simply thanked whoever had refused to let the story disappear after the cameras packed up and everyone else moved on. I folded that card carefully and slipped it into the same folder that held the public records request, the county documents, and my handwritten notes. Every now and then I still open that folder, not because I enjoy reliving the whole ordeal, but because it reminds me how ordinary people can make extraordinary differences without ever planning to become activists. I wasn't looking for a fight. I wasn't trying to embarrass the HOA. I certainly wasn't hoping to end up on the evening news. I was just a guy pulling weeds beside an old mailbox who happened to notice something that didn't feel right. And instead of convincing myself it was somebody else's problem, I kept asking questions until the answers finally surfaced. The shopping center is still busy today. Brookstone Ridge still looks as neat and polished as ever. Kids ride their bikes through the entrance. Delivery trucks come and go. New families move in without knowing any of this ever happened. Every now and then I'll see an ambulance drive through that same intersection without slowing down, and I catch myself smiling for reasons nobody around me could possibly understand. Sometimes the biggest victories are the ones nobody notices because nothing bad happens anymore. That's the strange thing about prevention. When it works, people assume there was never a problem to begin with. Every so often someone asks me if getting involved was really worth all the attention. After all, I didn't even live inside the neighborhood. My answer has never changed. Property lines don't stop emergencies. They don't stop fairness either. The moment we decide something isn't our business simply because it happens across the street, we hand over a little piece of responsibility that communities are built on. Looking back now, I don't think this story was ever really about a traffic light. It was about what happens when convenience quietly replaces common sense. When ordinary people assume somebody else has already checked the details, and when one person decides to pay attention instead of looking away. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you had been standing where I was, watching that ambulance trapped at the light, would you have gone digging through public records? Or would you have assumed the county knew what it was doing? Do you think the HOA simply made an honest mistake? Or should community leaders be held to a much higher standard whenever public safety is involved? I'd genuinely like to hear your opinion because there isn't one simple answer. And conversations like these matter more than most people realize. Drop your thoughts in the comments below if this story made you think, or reminded you of something you've seen in your own neighborhood. Share it with someone else. And if you enjoy true stories about everyday people standing up for what's right, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.